On the afternoon of May 13, 2010, the residents of Westcourt, Oklahoma were watching the sky. The day had started clear, unusually warm for early spring, but by mid-afternoon the wind shifted, thick, humid, and electric. Locals who'd lived through twisters before knew the signs. The clouds were too low, too green. Around 3:41 p.m., the National Weather Service issued a tornado emergency. By 3:49, sirens screamed through town. In the span of just minutes, the sky darkened and the EF-4 touched down 10 miles west, moving fast. The Kershaw family home sat directly in its path. Jenna Kershaw was a single mother, 34 years old, school secretary, lived quietly on a corner lot near the edge of town. Her 9-year-old son, Noah, was in 3rd grade, quiet, artistic, a kid who loved sketchbooks and rock collecting. When the sirens went off, neighbors said they saw Jenna run out onto the front lawn, barefoot, dragging Noah behind her. She didn't run toward shelter, she ran toward her car. That was the first strange detail. Most families had basements, Jenna did too, but she didn't go there. She popped the hatch on her SUV, shoved something inside, maybe a bag, and climbed in with her son. Then the storm hit. It carved a diagonal scar through Westcourt, ripping roofs, uprooting trees, tossing livestock, and reducing entire blocks to splinters. Jenna's house was flattened. When responders arrived hours later, they assumed the worst. Bodies were pulled from other homes, injuries were triaged in makeshift clinics. But when they reached the Kershaw lot, they found nothing. No bodies, no car. Just a concrete slab and fragments of wood and insulation. No blood, no debris field leading out. Just gone. At first, responders thought the car had been thrown. That happens. Vehicles lifted into the air, hurled into ponds, crushed under falling trees, but no sign of her SUV ever turned up. The ponds were dragged, the creeks checked, wooded areas searched. Rescue dogs were brought in the next morning, but they hit on nothing. Not a trace, no tire tracks leading away, no skid marks. Jenna and Noah had vanished as completely as the wind itself. Neighbors came forward with scattered accounts. One said she heard Jenna yell something just before the wind drowned her out. Another said he saw the SUV's taillights facing the road, but no one actually saw them drive off. Emergency dispatch logs show no 911 call from Jenna's number. Her phone's last signal was recorded by a tower just over half a mile east of her home. Odd, because that location was already supposed to be inside the tornado's path. Then the signal died. Not lost, not intermittent, dead. Like the phone had been turned off or destroyed. The town grieved, held vigils, pinned photos of Jenna and Noah to a bulletin board in front of City Hall. They were added to the list of casualties, one of dozens lost to that storm system. But something didn't sit right. Other storm victims had debris. Fields, wallets, shoes, seatbelts, burned-out engines, bone fragments, something. There's a footprint that nature leaves when it takes someone. But here, there was nothing. No one ever found her bag, Noah's glasses, the Polaroids she kept in her glove compartment. Nothing. 13 years later, investigators and family members still point to one unsettling fact. There's no scientific explanation for how a vehicle and 2 people could disappear so thoroughly, so instantly, in an event that lasted less than 4 minutes. Because while the storm destroyed everything it touched, it also left everything else behind. Everything except them. In the days that followed the tornado, Westcourt was a shell of itself. Wood-framed homes splintered into mulch, power lines tangled like vines, livestock carcasses bloating in open fields. The storm had cut through the land like a blade, and for emergency crews, it was the kind of scene where you expected grim discoveries by the hour. For most families, the losses were tangible, structures ruined, lives claimed, injuries treated, bodies recovered. But in the case of Jenna and Noah Kershaw, the absence was total. There was no closure, no evidence, no direction. Only a crater of silence where a mother and son used to be. Within 72 hours, coordinated search efforts were deployed. The National Guard worked alongside local fire departments, emergency management volunteers, and a disaster relief team brought in from Tulsa. They canvassed in sectors, marking off grid squares on weatherproof maps, dividing the land into manageable sweeps. The missing Kershaw SUV was at the top of the priority list. If they could locate the vehicle, they'd likely find answers. Search dogs were flown in from out of state, trained to detect both survivors and remains. They scoured the creek beds, irrigation ditches, stormwater drains, even barn foundations and downed trees. The dogs hit on multiple other victims, but never Jenna, never Noah. In total, the tornado left 38 confirmed fatalities across the Tri-County area. Most were found within the first 48 hours. Others were discovered weeks later under debris or washed into drainage culverts. But not a single item connected to the Kershaws turned up. No clothing, no photographs, no license plate fragments. The SUV, a gray 2007 Honda Pilot, had vanished without a trace. That alone was strange. Twisters could toss cars, but they didn't erase them. Speculation began to fill in the blanks. Some theorized that Jenna, panicked, had attempted to outrun the storm. Tornado preparedness experts strongly discourage it, but it wasn't unheard of. Others suggested she was trying to reach the school, perhaps believing Noah had been left behind. But that made no sense. Witnesses had seen her running with Noah toward the car. He was with her. What she was fleeing from, if not the tornado itself, became a growing question. Investigators reviewed traffic footage from 2 county-maintained roads and the single highway out of town. None of the time-stamped clips captured the Kershaw SUV. Even with the chaos and visibility issues caused by the storm, a vehicle would have triggered at least one of the infrared tripwires. It hadn't. The data suggested one thing. If Jenna drove off, she didn't leave on a main road. Then came an anomaly. 3 days after the storm, a parks maintenance worker inspecting flood damage near a wooded service trail just east of town noticed faint tire impressions leading into a patch of overgrown brush beside a drainage ditch. The pattern matched the tread style used by the Kershaw vehicle's tires. Investigators were called, but by the time they arrived, an overnight deluge had turned the area into a slurry of mud and runoff. Whatever trailhead existed was now underwater, erased by nature's indifference. They brought in pumps to clear the basin, but with each passing hour, the silt settled differently, distorting any impressions or paths. The theory was logged, possible exit route, direction unknown, but with nothing solid to pursue, it joined a growing pile of questions. Shelters were checked, hospitals too. Jenna's face was circulated across state lines, so was Noah's. They were entered into the National Missing Persons Registry, but no one came forward with sightings, no credit cards used, no calls made from her number again. Her driver's license, insurance, and social security number remained dormant. It was as if both of them had been swallowed whole. 2 weeks in, the case's intensity waned. The state focused on recovery and reconstruction. Insurance companies settled losses. The disaster's broader narrative took over. Jenna and Noah's disappearance became folded into the category of unconfirmed casualties. Officially, they were listed as missing, presumed deceased, one of the many families for whom no remains could be recovered. But inside the sheriff's department, not everyone agreed. The file was marked quietly with an asterisk, a case to revisit when resources allowed, because something about the Kershaw disappearance didn't match the others. Not just the lack of evidence, but the way the trail had seemed to lead somewhere, only to vanish. Not destroyed, not missed, just erased. By November of 2010, the case was quietly shelved. The sheriff's department had exhausted its overtime budget, FEMA reports were finalized, and all but 2 of the 38 tornado-related missing persons cases had been resolved. Jenna and Noah remained among the final unknowns, and with no confirmed sightings, no physical evidence, and no proof of criminal involvement, the state concluded that they had been lost in the storm. It was the kind of bureaucratic ending that sounded official, final, and explainable, even if it wasn't. Their file was stamped and archived, no further action required. But not everyone accepted that conclusion. Jenna's younger sister, Danielle, had never believed her sibling simply vanished. She knew Jenna too well. knew how protective she was of Noah, knew she wouldn't have panicked and driven blindly into a tornado's path without calling someone, anyone. And she certainly wouldn't have taken back roads with a funnel cloud bearing down behind her. To Danielle, something was missing, and it wasn't just the car. With no legal authority and limited resources, Danielle began her own investigation. She used social media to push the story, offering a $2,000 reward for any confirmed information. She created flyers in both English and Spanish, distributed them at rest stops, diners, gas stations, anywhere within 100 miles of Westcourt. She contacted local news outlets, did interviews, and eventually set up a small website with a toll-free tip line. Most of what came through was noise. People with false memories, confusion about storm dates, or vague comments about seeing a woman and kid at some point in May. But Danielle tracked every single one. And slowly, one detail began to repeat. A red barn. Several tips referenced a red barn off a rural service road east of town. Some said they'd seen headlights near it the evening of the tornado. Others remembered a vehicle parked there long after the area had been cleared. Danielle started focusing on that service road, County Route 38B, a narrow, rutted lane mostly used by utility crews and hunters. It didn't show up on all maps. It wasn't paved, and after the storm, part of it had been washed out. But it ran parallel to the drainage ditch where the tire marks had once been seen. And there, she learned, was where a group of storm chasers had briefly stopped to reposition their equipment that same day. One of them, a part-time meteorology student from Texas, had kept his dashcam footage. Danielle emailed him, called him, eventually drove 7 hours to meet him in person. He hadn't reviewed the footage in detail, it was just routine data for him, but he agreed to let her see it. The clip, dated May 13, 2010, 3:46 p.m., showed the student's truck parked on the side of the dirt road. The sky was turning, darkening in pulses, the wind erratic. At the edge of the frame, just barely visible between two trees, were taillights. Not headlights. Taillights, meaning the vehicle was facing away from the storm. The shape of it, a high rear hatch, the sloped angle of the back window, was eerily similar to a 2007 Honda Pilot. Danielle froze the footage, played it again, zoomed in. The resolution was poor, grainy, distorted by light flare and digital compression, but the outline was there. She couldn't prove it was Jenna's car, but the timestamp was damning, 3:46 p.m. That was 3 minutes before the tornado reached that exact area, which meant whoever that vehicle belonged to had been on that remote road, facing east, directly in the Kershaw SUV's last known direction of travel. Possibly trying to escape, or maybe hiding. She brought the footage to Westcourt PD. The lead investigator gave it a glance, nodded, and handed it off to state authorities. Days passed, then weeks. Eventually, the response came back. Inconclusive, too distant, too poor quality, no license plate, no identifying marks, no proof of connection to the missing. The footage was logged but not pursued. The case status didn't change. Danielle was furious. To her, this wasn't nothing. It was the first new data point in months. It proved at least one vehicle was on that road, possibly Jenna's, possibly fleeing or being followed. But the official position remained unchanged. Without hard evidence, without a body, without a confirmed sighting, the case was closed. But that moment in the dash cam, the flicker of taillights through trees on a dirt road moments before disaster, it stayed with her. Because if Jenna had really been trying to get away from the storm, there were safer ways out. But if she was trying to avoid something else entirely, then the storm might have just been the cover, not the cause. It was 13 months after the storm, well past the news cycle, long after the last insurance claims had been processed and most of the scars in Westcourt had started to heal, when a new piece of evidence surfaced. It didn't come from a tip or from a search team or even from a cold case review. It came by accident. During a routine audit of emergency call logs in a neighboring county, a state communications supervisor stumbled across a flagged 911 call that had never been officially processed. The timestamp was from May 13, 2010. The originating number was registered to Jenna Kershaw. The call had lasted 37 seconds. It had been routed not to Westcourt's dispatch, but to a small center in Lake Haven, a rural jurisdiction over 40 miles away. A misroute like that was rare but not impossible, especially during heavy tower traffic and cross-county interference caused by severe weather. But what was most troubling wasn't the technical glitch. It was what was on the tape. The audio was degraded. The storm could already be heard in the background. Gusting wind, faint thunder, static crackling across the line like it was being dragged underwater. But Jenna's voice was unmistakable. She was whispering, her tone tight with panic. The first thing they could make out was, "We're not safe." A few seconds later, "He's outside." Then silence. The line stayed open, faint rustling heard, possibly movement, maybe breathing, but nothing intelligible. Then the call dropped. There was no follow-up, no callback, no secondary ping. It ended as abruptly as it had begun. When the audit flagged the number, the system cross-referenced it with Westcourt's records, triggering a notification to state investigators. At first, it was assumed to be a duplicate, but when analysts traced the cell tower origin, they found it had pinged from just under a mile northeast of Jenna's house, right in the same direction the dashcam footage had pointed toward. The timestamp placed it at exactly 3:43 p.m., 6 minutes before the tornado hit that sector. And most disturbingly, it meant that Jenna was not only alive at that moment, but that she had enough time, clarity, and terror to whisper the words, "He's outside." State police were notified. So was the Westcourt Sheriff's Department. The Kershaw file was reopened, quietly and without announcement. The call shifted everything. No longer could the case be assumed to be purely weather-related. No longer could it be ruled accidental or random. If Jenna had been hiding, if she'd been watching someone through a window, afraid to be seen, then her disappearance wasn't just a tragedy. It might have been a crime. Danielle was called in to listen to the raw recording. It was the first time in over a year that she heard her sister's voice, and even distorted, even barely above a whisper, it stopped her cold. She knew that voice. She knew that tone. It wasn't fear of the storm. Jenna had lived in Oklahoma her whole life. That voice belonged to someone who was cornered, who was being hunted, and whoever she meant by he, it wasn't nature. Speculation ignited behind closed doors. Detectives began re-interviewing the original responders. A few recalled minor things, details dismissed at the time. One remembered a back door to the Kershaw house found unlocked but unbroken. Another mentioned that the SUV's tire tracks, which had vanished in the flood, had shown no signs of skidding or fishtailing, suggesting the car hadn't been fleeing blindly. It had been controlled, directed. But the biggest question hung over everything. Who was he? There was no active restraining order on file. Jenna hadn't named anyone in the call. There had been no known threats, no legal disputes, no confirmed stalkers. If there had been someone in her life she was afraid of, it hadn't been on record. Some wondered if it was her ex-husband. Others suggested a neighbor, a stranger, but nothing in her background gave it shape. And then came the administrative question. Why hadn't this call surfaced in the original investigation? The answer, again, came down to clerical oversight. Because the call had been routed to a different dispatch center, and because it never formally connected to a live operator, it had been automatically categorized as a dropped call and digitally archived, out of jurisdiction, out of context, and out of view. Until someone happened to find it 13 months too late. Theories of abduction, already whispered quietly by a few, now began to gain momentum. Maybe Jenna hadn't fled the storm. Maybe she'd fled someone. Or maybe someone had used the storm as cover, someone who knew how to time it, someone who knew the roads, someone who, for 13 years, had never been named. The call, incomplete as it was, cracked the case open. But it also deepened the mystery. Because if Jenna had been hiding from someone that day, if she'd seen him, feared him, called for help, and then vanished entirely, then what happened next must have happened in the 6 minutes no one could ever account for. Micah Langley had spent 20 years chasing storms across Oklahoma. first as a volunteer responder, then as a regional emergency coordinator. He'd retired just a year before the 2010 tornado and remembered the Westcourt disaster in fragments, wind maps, casualty reports, crude GPS overlays of damage paths. But it wasn't until he read about the misrouted 911 call, quietly reported in a regional paper, a buried paragraph beneath a human interest piece on WeatherTech failures, that the Kershaw case lodged itself in his mind. Something about it wouldn't let go. A mother whispering, "He's outside," and then disappearing into a tornado that never left a trace. Langley had no badge, no funding, no jurisdiction. But he had time. He had maps. And he had instincts sharpened by decades of navigating chaos. He started from the last knowns: Jenna's house, the phone ping, the trail of tire impressions that had disappeared under floodwater. He mapped it out like a meteorologist, overlaying damage assessments with utility records, property lines, and satellite data from just before and just after the storm. He wasn't looking for new evidence, not yet. He was looking for gaps. It was in one of those gaps that he found the cabin. County records listed it as destroyed. It had been a hunting lodge in the 1980s, one of several built for seasonal bow hunters before the land was parceled and sold off to private hands. The structure sat about 4.5 miles northeast of Westcourt, along a barely-there logging trail that hadn't been maintained in decades. But when Langley pulled up old NOAA aerial images, something didn't line up. The post-storm satellite pass showed no structural damage. The roof appeared intact. The surrounding tree canopy was undisturbed. Whatever the county believed, that cabin hadn't been touched. He drove out there alone in the fall of 2011, using GPS coordinates to locate the overgrown path. It took 2 hours of maneuvering through brush and washed-out trail ruts to reach the site. When he did, he found the cabin still standing, leaning slightly, weather-worn, but intact. The windows were clouded with dust and lichen, the door hanging askew. Inside, the air smelled like mildew and mouse droppings. The walls were stained from years of rain seepage, but it didn't feel ransacked or vandalized, just forgotten. Langley moved slowly, noting items by habit: rusted pans, a tipped-over cot, a broken oil lamp near the door. Dust patterns told him what hadn't been moved in years. But then, behind the old wood-burning stove, something caught his eye. A sliver of blue, trapped in the corner seam where soot had darkened the floorboards. He reached down and pulled out a small piece of synthetic fabric, charred around the edges, stiff with melted plastic. It looked like part of a child's shoe. He didn't touch anything else. He bagged the find, noted the location, photographed the interior, and left. Back in Tulsa, he reached out to a friend in the state crime lab. It took weeks of quiet processing, but the results came back. The DNA on the fabric belonged to Noah Kershaw. It was the first confirmed evidence that Jenna and Noah had made it out of the storm's immediate path, that they had taken refuge somewhere, that they were alive, at least for a time, after the phone call. The shoe fragment didn't prove how long they stayed or who else had been there. But it did prove one thing: the tornado hadn't taken them. Langley turned his findings over to Westcourt PD. The cabin was sealed off, entered into evidence. Detectives swept it with ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, luminol. But the interior showed nothing more. The stove had been used recently, but by who and when, no one could say. There were no prints, no blood, no further artifacts. Just the smell of ash, the rustle of insects, and a sense of absence that settled into the walls like moisture. Danielle was notified. For the first time since her sister vanished, she had physical confirmation. Her nephew had been in that room. The realization was both a relief and a rupture, because now the question wasn't just where they had gone, it was why they had ended up there, and who else might have known they had. The case was reopened, but the next steps weren't clear, because if someone had brought them to that place, it meant someone had also taken them away. Langley didn't stop at the cabin. The discovery of Noah's shoe fragment had confirmed what many had only suspected. Jenna and her son had survived past the moment the tornado touched down. But where they went next, and who they may have encountered, remained the crucial gap. He expanded his map radius, plotting every homestead, derelict building, fire road, and property line within a 10-mile radius of the site. In one corner of the grid, barely inside county records, was a name he hadn't seen in years: Elwin Browder, 71, former soybean farmer. No known relatives, no active utilities. His land bordered the creek less than half a mile from the cabin. The county considered him uncooperative, hadn't paid property tax in 6 years, hadn't registered a vehicle in more than a decade, but Langley remembered the name. Bruder had once donated livestock during a tornado relief effort in '93. Kept to himself, but wasn't cruel. Just off the grid in every sense. If anyone had seen something that day, it might have been him. It took 3 separate visits to reach Browder's home, a series of handwritten signs: private property, no entry, trespassers will be shot, lined the narrow trail like sentries. Langley left notes, waited by the edge of the gate, and eventually, on the 3rd day, was met by the crack of an old screen door and a hard voice asking what the hell he wanted. Langley explained the situation plainly. He wasn't law enforcement, he wasn't press, he wasn't there to make accusations. He was just trying to answer a question that had haunted a family for over a decade. Browder didn't respond at first, just squinted through thick yellowed glasses and chewed his lip. Then he told Langley to wait, turned around, and disappeared back inside. 10 minutes passed before he returned. He didn't invite Langley in, just stepped down off the porch and lit a cigarette with a weathered Zippo. "I saw him," he said without being asked. "Day of the Twister." Langley kept quiet, letting the silence stretch. Browder went on, voice low, deliberate. He said he'd been down by the creek that afternoon, checking the drainage trenches near his shed. He'd heard shouting, muffled, rushed. When he looked up, he saw a woman and a boy crouched behind a fallen log near the bank. The woman was wet, barefoot, clutching something to her chest. The boy had a backpack. They looked terrified. He called out, said they could come in, wait out the storm in his cellar. The woman stood up halfway, looked toward him, and then bolted the other way, dragging the boy, not toward the road, deeper into the woods. He said she looked like she didn't even see the storm, just him, like he was the thing she was afraid of. Langley asked why he didn't report it. Browder stared at the trees, said when the news started showing missing posters, he figured it had to be them. But he didn't want to get involved, didn't trust cops. Figured if he said something he'd be blamed, either for not doing more or worse for doing too much. He'd been down that road once, long ago. Didn't want to do it again. Langley asked him if he remembered what they were wearing. He didn't, not really. Said the woman had dark clothes, hair stuck to her face. The boy had blue on, maybe green. But he remembered the vehicle. Said he'd seen it parked along the slope just past the tree line, maybe 20 yards off. Rust-colored SUV, hatchback. Looked like it had been pulled in carefully, not crashed. The kind of parking job that says someone didn't want it seen. When the storm passed, he went to look, but it was gone. He figured they'd either made it out or someone else had picked them up. Either way, the car was no longer there. And after that, the flood came. The river rose, the paths washed out, and any tracks they might have left vanished under mud and runoff. Langley drove back in silence, turning the story over in his mind. The timeline aligned almost too well. Jenna's last phone ping, the dash cam sighting, the tire marks leading to nowhere, all pointing to that same wooded sector. And now, a witness, however reluctant, had seen them alive, moving, terrified. But there was something in Browder's story that wouldn't settle. The way Jenna had reacted, not just afraid, but purposeful. She wasn't fleeing randomly. She was making choices, calculated ones, staying off the roads, parking out of sight, refusing help. It wasn't just the storm she was running from. It was someone she knew, someone she feared would find her if she let anyone else get close. For Langley, the lead was solid, but it didn't solve anything. It only opened a new door, one with deeper shadows, because now they knew Jenna and Noah had been alive, mobile, and actively hiding. Which meant the question wasn't just where they went. It was who they were trying to stay invisible from. It came from a box, not a revelation from forensics or a tip from the public, but a simple manila box unearthed during an office reorganization at the West Court Courthouse. Inside were civil filings, most related to storm-related insurance disputes. But wedged between housing complaints and custody petitions was a yellowed, unsent notice stamped temporary protective order, pending service. The name at the top, Jenna Kershaw. The respondent, Richard Kershaw, her ex-husband. The document was dated March 30th, 2010, 6 weeks before the tornado. It outlined claims of escalating intimidation, late-night visits, and threats made in front of Noah. Jenna had requested the order through a victims advocacy program, citing a series of increasingly erratic voicemails and one incident in which Richard allegedly followed her home from work. The request had been approved by a local judge for temporary protection, but it had never been served. The sheriff's department tried to locate Richard in state, but by the time the paperwork was ready, he was gone. Moved across state lines, no forwarding address, no confirmation of receipt. The order expired 10 days later, unserved and forgotten, until now. Langley brought the document to Danielle, who hadn't known about it. But when she read Jenna's words, it wasn't a surprise. Jenna had confided pieces of it, his temper, his drinking, the way he'd twist words into threats and smile while doing it. They'd been divorced for 3 years, and for most of that time, he'd stayed away. But something must have changed that spring. Investigators reopened the file. Richard Kershaw was located in Amarillo, Texas, working as a subcontractor for a moving company. When contacted, he was calm, even helpful. Said he hadn't seen Jenna or Noah since the prior Thanksgiving. Claimed he didn't know anything about a restraining order. Said he'd heard about the storm, had seen the news about Westcourt, but didn't think they were still living there. His answers came easy. Too easy. When asked where he'd been during the storm, he said home. When pressed for specifics, he amended, said he was on a delivery route. Passing through Oklahoma, yes, but not stopping in Westcourt. Cell tower logs told a different story. On the afternoon of May 12th, the day before the tornado, Richard's phone pinged multiple towers between Tulsa and Westcourt. One of them put him inside town limits at 2:37 p.m., a fact he hadn't offered and later tried to frame as a short detour for gas. But no purchase records supported that. He made no calls, sent no texts, just moved through the area, silent. The discovery reopened wounds that had barely started to scab. Danielle was livid. She brought out an old notebook Jenna used to keep by her bed, full of to-do lists, budget notes, reminders. Tucked into the back were fragments of thoughts scribbled like vents. One read, "If he shows up again, I'm not answering the door. I'll take Noah and leave first." Another, "He doesn't knock. He waits." Danielle turned to investigators and asked the obvious question, how many more coincidences would it take before Richard was treated as more than a footnote? He had motive, a known history of threats, a temporary restraining order, and a presence in town the day before Jenna disappeared. And then there was the phrase in the 911 call. "He's outside." The weight of it now felt heavier, specific. But the case wasn't built on feelings, and technically, Richard hadn't violated any active order. Without a served document, there was no legal standing for restraint or monitoring. And Richard had an answer for everything. He said he was just passing through, that he'd had no idea she was still in Westcourt, that he loved his son, that if he'd known they were missing, he would have helped search. Still, something rang hollow in his voice. The timing, the silence, the detour, and the way he seemed to anticipate the questions as if he'd prepared for them long before anyone asked. No charges were filed, no arrest was made. But for Danielle and Langley, the direction was clear. Jenna had been afraid of someone. She'd taken Noah and run. She'd parked her car out of sight, she'd tried to hide, and she'd made one final whisper into a phone line before disappearing forever. They couldn't say with certainty who he was, but the deeper they looked, the more one name kept circling back like a shadow that never left the edge of the light. It was June 2023 when the drought reached its worst point in nearly 2 decades. Reservoirs cracked, cattle died, and the forest around Westcourt turned brittle and yellow. County workers were dispatched to clear brush and check runoff channels near old flood-prone areas, including the lowland drainage basin northeast of town, just a few miles from where Jenna Kershaw's phone had last pinged 13 years earlier. Most of the work was routine, cutting back overgrowth, spraying for ticks, removing dried treefall before fire season. But when the backhoe struck metal beneath a shallow hillock near the embankment, everything stopped. At first, they thought it was storm debris, maybe an old irrigation tank or rusted-out livestock trailer. But as more earth was cleared, the contours took shape. A wheel well, a rear hatch, the bent frame of a license plate long stripped of paint. The number was faint but still legible. It matched the Kershaw SUV. After 13 years, the car had been found, and it had been buried. The vehicle was partially collapsed under its own weight, compressed by layers of mud and runoff, most of the undercarriage twisted and rusted. The storm hadn't thrown it there. It had been driven off-road and covered. Floodwaters had likely disguised the burial, turning the low-lying area into a seasonal pond for years. But now, in the dry light of day, the truth was exposed. Forensics moved quickly. The SUV was removed intact, the soil around it excavated for trace evidence. No human remains were found inside, no bone fragments, no tissue, no signs of a violent struggle. But what was inside? Its own story. On the passenger floorboard, a child's drawing sealed inside a Ziploc freezer bag. In the center console, a gold-plated heart-shaped locket, scratched but unbroken, confirmed as Jenna's. On the back seat, a jacket, blood-stained, with fibers matched to the shirt Jenna had been wearing in a family photo from 2 weeks before the storm. The blood analysis confirmed it was hers, not life-threatening, not arterial, but significant. A head wound, maybe, a gash, something that would have bled steadily. And then there was the airbag. The driver's side had deployed. The passenger side hadn't. There were no skid marks around the site, but impressions remained. A curved trajectory from the gravel trail toward the ditch, as if the vehicle had been turned off the main path intentionally. Investigators debated theories. Had Jenna swerved to avoid something? Had someone else taken control of the vehicle? The damage didn't suggest a crash. It was slow, deliberate movement. There was no glass spray, no bumper crush. It didn't read like panic. It read like control. The Ziploc bag was what turned everything. Inside the drawing, done in heavy crayon on school-lined paper, was a simple image. A creek, a house, and 2 stick figures, one tall, one smaller, holding hands. Above them, a cloud with slashes of blue, rain, or maybe wind. In the lower corner, a red shape. A car, possibly. Behind it, a black scribble, rounded like a figure standing apart. Unlabeled. It wasn't evidence in a legal sense, but it said something. Noah had been alive when they left the vehicle. He had time or instruction to seal his drawing. That meant they weren't taken from the car by force. They exited willingly, or had been told to. The discovery electrified the town. News stations returned. The Kershaw's names resurfaced in headlines. Danielle, now in her early 40s, stood outside the sheriff's office the morning the announcement was made and gave a statement filled with equal parts hope and grief. "We always said they didn't just disappear," she said. "They went somewhere, and someone knew that." Langley returned to the site, walked the perimeter, measured out where the tire impressions ended, looked for paths, for animal trails, for any sign of where Jenna and Noah might have gone. But the drought had turned the earth to dust. If they'd walked out of that place 13 years ago, nature had erased the route behind them. Still, there was no mistaking the core truth. Someone buried the car, not the storm, not the current. Someone deliberately concealed the vehicle, locking inside it evidence that confirmed the Kershaws had made it through the initial storm alive. That meant someone knew where they went next. Someone had either helped them vanish or made sure no one ever found out. The recovery of the Kershaw SUV triggered a formal reopening of the case. Westcourt PD, working alongside state forensic specialists, launched a full reassessment of every object pulled from the vehicle. High-resolution scans of interior surfaces turned up several smudged and degraded fingerprints, many too partial or warped to identify. but one stood out. A single partial print on the inside of the rear passenger side door, lifted just beneath the window frame. It didn't match Jenna. It didn't match Noah. And it didn't match Richard Kershaw. Instead, the print traced back to a man named Alvin Morse. Morse had been a volunteer firefighter during the 2010 tornado, part of the initial response crew operating out of the north side of Westcourt. He'd assisted with evacuations, handled equipment, and had even helped coordinate early search operations. At the time, nothing flagged him. He was quiet, dependable, with no criminal history. A veteran. After the storm, he left Oklahoma and resettled in Wyoming. His departure wasn't considered suspicious. Plenty of first responders changed careers or left towns after disasters. It wasn't uncommon. Until now, he'd never been connected to the Kershaw case. Investigators traced him to a trailer on the outskirts of Cheyenne. When contacted by phone, Morse answered calmly. He didn't deny being in Westcourt. He didn't ask questions. He simply agreed to meet detectives for an interview the following morning. He even confirmed his address. But when local deputies arrived at 9 a.m. to escort him, they found him dead. He'd taken his own life sometime during the night. The trailer was sparse, cluttered, but not in disarray. No note was found. There were signs of long-term anxiety. Prescription bottles, a therapy notepad, shredded letters. In the kitchen trash, a burned photo, too blackened to identify. In a locked storage unit 2 miles away, registered in Morse's name, investigators made a chilling discovery. Inside a plastic tub was a child's school backpack, faded blue, torn at the bottom corner. Inside were 2 children's books, A Wrinkle in Time and Journey Under the Sea, both bearing the checkout stamp of the E. Westcourt Public Library, dated May 11, 2010, 2 days before the tornado. Also in the backpack, a folded laminated card with emergency contact information listing Jenna Kershaw as the primary guardian. The handwriting was confirmed to be hers. It was a seismic break in the case. It proved that Morse had direct contact with either Jenna, Noah, or both. Whether he had found the items in the wreckage, taken them for reasons unknown, or had encountered the 2 alive after the storm, none of that could be determined conclusively. But the fact that those personal items remained in his possession, sealed and preserved, pointed to something far more deliberate than chance. No other forensic evidence in the storage unit tied him to violence. No blood, no clothing, no photographs. Just the bag. A single container of memory, kept in isolation for over a decade. Authorities could never question Morse. His silence left a void no investigation could fully fill. Psychological analysts brought in later would speculate. Maybe he had found Jenna and Noah wandering after the tornado, injured or afraid. Maybe he took them in, meaning to help. Maybe something went wrong. Or maybe he watched something happen and said nothing. Theories ranged from mercy to guilt to complicity. Danielle was notified the same day the backpack was logged. She didn't speak at first, just held the books in gloved hands and stared at the checkout stamps, her mouth trembling. She read to him every night, she finally whispered, even when she was too tired to stand, even when they were afraid. The investigators built a rough picture. Morse had access to roadblocks. He could move through town unnoticed. He could have seen the Kershaw SUV parked on the slope. He could have offered help, or something else. His print on the passenger door suggested proximity, but without more, they couldn't define his role. The evidence remained circumstantial, evocative, but legally hollow. The public narrative swelled with speculation. Was Morse a savior turned haunted witness, or something else entirely? Had Jenna trusted the wrong person in the storm's wake, or had Morse become a guardian for 2 souls who no longer had anyone else? The discovery of the SUV proved they had exited that vehicle alive. The backpack proved they'd had time. But the 13 years that followed were filled with nothing but silence, and that silence now had a name. Morse's death closed one door and opened another. What had happened in the hours after the tornado now felt closer than ever. But just as it seemed within reach, the answers vanished again, swallowed by a man who took the final truth with him. By early spring 2024, The Kershaw case had receded again into the quiet corners of law enforcement backlogs. There had been too many dead ends, too many speculative threads that unraveled under scrutiny. The discovery of the SUV, the backpack in Alvin Morse's storage unit, even the shoe fragment in the hunting cabin, each had reignited the investigation, only to lead it back into silence. No arrests had been made, no bodies had been confirmed, and though suspicion clung to the names of two men, Richard Kershaw and Alvin Morse, neither could be questioned. One had vanished. The other was dead. But then the lab in Tulsa began quietly reprocessing the evidence. Technological advances in layered imaging and pressure-sensitive paper analysis had opened a new avenue. Analysts were reevaluating paper-based evidence across unsolved cases. In the Kershaw file, that included a sealed Ziploc bag pulled from the backseat of the SUV. Inside it, a crayon drawing done by Noah, stored in a way that had preserved it remarkably well. On the surface, the picture seemed simple. A line-drawn creek bending toward a square box with a pointed roof, likely a cabin. 3 stick figures stood to the right. 2 were side by side, one tall, one small. The third stood apart, larger, heavily scribbled over, "No face." Above the tallest figure, Noah had drawn a speech bubble with 3 words. Not him, not safe. The words were shaky but deliberate. The drawing had been cataloged and photographed at the time of discovery, but nothing about it had been considered actionable. At best, it had been interpreted as symbolic, a frightened child's interpretation of a stressful memory. But in March of 2024, an intern at the forensic lab flagged something unusual. When the drawing was scanned under high-intensity ultraviolet layering, subtle indentations became visible beneath the crayon, like ghost lines buried under pressure. A second image, drawn earlier and then overwritten. Digital reconstruction began. It took nearly 2 weeks to isolate the lower image, but eventually, the lines resolved into something unmistakable. A map. Not precise, not labeled, but recognizable. A winding creek similar in shape to the one drawn above, a squared structure near a tree line, and a trail dotted with small exits that veered away from where the SUV had been found. This wasn't a child's artistic doodle. It was a directional sketch, a representation of location, and someone had drawn it with the clarity of purpose. Using the topographic data surrounding the SUV recovery site, analysts overlaid Noah's hidden drawing against known floodplain maps. The trail he'd drawn led to a place the search teams had never gone. A higher elevation point, 7 miles upstream, positioned just outside the standard grid used during the original post-tornado search. It was an area dense with tree cover, inaccessible by vehicle, and marked in county records as undeveloped. No structures were supposed to exist there. But when aerial imagery was pulled, something caught the light. A shape, angular, collapsing in on itself. A roofline partially consumed by tree growth. Authorities dispatched a team. It took 3 hours by foot and ATV to reach the site, the trail obscured by over a decade of seasonal runoff and overgrowth. What they found was the skeletal remains of a structure, an unrecorded shack long since rotted through. Its walls were bowing outward. A stone chimney had collapsed through the back, but the floor remained mostly intact. The building didn't appear on any utility map. It had no septic system, no electrical lines, no sign of ever having been officially occupied. Yet inside, there were signs of human presence, rusted tin plates, a broken chair leg, shards of glass that might have once been a lantern. But what mattered most was beneath the floorboards. When forensic teams carefully lifted the loose planks, they found a cavity, not deep, maybe 2 feet, but filled with compacted silt and clay, and buried inside it, fragments, bone, not many, 4 in total, a partial femur, 2 ribs, and a section of vertebrae. They were small, consistent with a child between the ages of 8 and 10. There was no clothing, no tissue, no teeth, too degraded for DNA. But the shape, size, and context pointed to one conclusion. Noah had been here, or someone his size had, and whoever had drawn that map had wanted the site to be found. News of the discovery did not go public at first. Investigators moved quietly, submitting the remains to 2 labs, one in Oklahoma, one out of state, for separate analysis. The results came back nearly identical. The bones were human. The environmental damage was consistent with 13 years of weather exposure and biological degradation. The chances of a forensic match to the Kershaw family were low, but not impossible. A mitochondrial DNA test was ordered using samples Danielle had submitted years earlier. The process would take months. In the meantime, detectives reviewed everything again: the SUV, the backpack in Morse's unit, the unserved restraining order, the dash cam footage, the 911 call, the child's drawing. None of it was definitive. None of it was enough for an indictment. But together, they formed a mosaic of despair and survival, one that suggested Jenna had fought to protect her son long after the tornado ended, that they had escaped the immediate danger only to fall into something quieter, darker, something that hunted them slowly. Danielle was brought to the shack 3 weeks later. It had been stabilized temporarily, flagged for preservation while legal jurisdiction was sorted. She stood beside the perimeter tape, hands in her coat, looking at the foundation that had held what little might be left of her nephew. She didn't cry, didn't speak. But when the lead investigator offered to show her the digitally reconstructed map, she refused. "He already showed me," she said quietly. "We just didn't listen soon enough." Authorities debated the next step. There was pressure to name a suspect. Richard Kershaw's name surfaced again, so did Morse's, even in death, but without evidence placing either man at the shack and with Morse already deceased. Prosecution was impossible. The case remained open but unsolved. A cold case made colder by the fact that its central witnesses, Jenna and Noah, had both disappeared into the wind and the silence left behind. The drawing was stored again, now with enhanced scans and annotated overlays, but it remained, at its core, what it had always been: a child's attempt to speak when words had run out, a cry written in crayon, a map hidden beneath fear. The shack was razed that summer. The bones were interred anonymously at a small cemetery outside Westcourt. The marker reads simply, "Beloved, missed, found." Whether it was Noah or not, the family chose to believe it was. It was the closest thing they would ever have to an answer. To this day, no one can say with certainty what happened in those woods. No arrest was made. No full remains were ever recovered. No final statement was ever written. The Kershaw file remains active, but untouched, its pages filled with half-truths and too-late clues. But in the end, there is this: a sealed plastic bag, a crayon drawing, a faceless figure looming in the dark, and 3 words scrawled by a boy who was afraid, but not silent. Not him, not safe. Whatever happened to Jenna and Noah after the tornado, it didn't end in that storm. It ended somewhere deeper, somewhere slower. And someone, maybe both of them, tried to make sure the truth, however fragile, wouldn't stay buried forever.